What did people in Jerusalem eat for breakfast 3,000 years ago? How did they live? What did they wear? What did they worry about? What made them laugh? What did a mother say to her child as they set off for school? What did a merchant argue about at the market? How did a priest feel when he entered the temple for the first time? Not kings, prophets, or heroes, but ordinary people. How did they actually spend their days? We know everything about Jerusalem's wars. We know about every conquest, every destruction, and every empire that passed through here. But wars do not define this city. It is made up of the people who wake up every morning to bake their bread, argue with their neighbors, raise their children, and hope for a better tomorrow. 3,000 years ago, Jerusalem was home to around 10,000 people. There was no electricity. There was no running water. Windows had no glass. The streets were narrow and dusty in summer, turning to mud in winter. The smell of animals, cooking fires, and unwashed bodies hung in the air. And yet, people fell in love here. People told jokes here. They cheated one another at the market and then prayed for forgiveness in the temple. They got drunk, argued about politics, and gossiped about their neighbors. The same things people do today, the same events, just in a different setting. This is not the history of Jerusalem's kings and conquerors. This is the history of everyone else. The baker who woke up before dawn, the woman carrying water from the well, the child running through streets that smelled of fresh bread and donkey dung, the priest who performed the same ritual every morning for 30 years. This is a day in ancient Jerusalem. What was life actually like here 3,000 years ago? If you've subscribed, shall we begin? The day begins before sunrise. Not with an alarm, it begins with the sounds of animals. First the roosters, then the donkeys, followed by the general din of a city that has no choice but to wake up as daylight breaks. In ancient Jerusalem, darkness was expensive and daylight was precious. Oil lamps were expensive. People would go to sleep when it grew dark and wake up when it grew light because the alternative cost money that most people did not have. In most households, it was the woman who woke up first, as in every era. This is not an emotional approach, it is archaeology. Physical evidence from ancient Israeli homes tells a consistent story. The grinding stone is found near the entrance and is used for the first task of the day. Grain was either ground the night before or at dawn. The grain was mixed with water, shaped into flat rounds, and baked in a clay pan over the carefully preserved embers of the previous night's fire. Lighting a new fire was hard work, so the embers saved overnight were highly prized. Breakfast in ancient Jerusalem was simple: flatbread, barley for the poor, and wheat for the wealthy, olives, figs and dates, if in season, a handful of roasted grain. If you were wealthy, you might have had a little soft cheese too, water or diluted wine. It actually seems quite healthy. There was no coffee, there was no tea either, there was no orange juice. The children would eat first, then leave the house. The boys would go to the scribe school, which was attached to the temple. They would learn to read by studying the Torah. They would learn to write by copying sacred texts. In ancient Jerusalem, education was religious education. The text was the curriculum. They placed great importance on education. Girls would stay at home. This is not a judgment, it is a fact. Their education consisted of learning household skills, such as cooking, weaving, and managing the household economy. In ancient Israel, managing a household was akin to running a complex operation. She was responsible for food and textile production, childcare, and preserving and storing everything the family needed to get through the winter. Although women might have appeared to be in the background, the well-being of the household actually depended on their skills. Men went out to work. During the reigns of David and Solomon, Jerusalem's economy rested on three pillars: the temple, trade, and agriculture. The temple generated massive demand for specialists such as priests, Levites, musicians, craftsmen, builders, butchers, and bakers of showbread. Trade routes passing through Jerusalem linked Egypt to Mesopotamia, and the city lay on the most efficient mountain route between the two regions. Merchants from Egypt, Phoenicia, and Arabia were constantly passing through. The surrounding countryside, the Judean hills, and the valleys below produced olives, grapes, figs, barley, and wheat. Farmers came into the city to sell their produce at the market. City dwellers went out to the fields at harvest time. By mid-morning, the market was in full swing. The market was at the heart of everything. Of course, it was about trade, buying and selling grain, oil, pottery, cloth, and livestock. But it was also about information. News spread through the markets. Gossip spread through the markets, too. Political views spread through the markets, too. In a world without newspapers, where most people could not read or write, the market was the place to find out what was happening. It was the most natural form of socializing. Who was ill? Who had died? What decision had the king made? Were the Philistines raiding again? Had the harvest in the Jezreel Valley been successful? Weights and measures at the market were a constant source of dispute. The Torah explicitly forbids dishonest weights, which shows just how widespread the practice was. Merchants with two sets of weights, one for buying and one for selling, were such a common occurrence that they even made it into the New Testament. The same arguments, the same trickery, the same anger, 3,000 years ago. In ancient Jerusalem, thousands of ordinary people passed by the temple every morning. Not inside it, though, just past it. The temple was not open to everyone. The outer court, however, was open to all. Anyone could enter there, but the inner courts belonged only to the priests. The Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, was entered by one person only, once a year, the high priest, on Yom Kippur. Everyone else, every baker, merchant, and farmer, and every child running about the market, lived their entire lives in a place where they could see the holiest object of their faith, yet could never come any closer than the outer courtyard. That is the question. What would it be like to spend your whole life next to something you could never fully access? Waking up every morning to see smoke rising from the temple and hear the Levite musicians playing, knowing that the very center of your civilization's beliefs was permanently and deliberately inaccessible, was that comforting? Was that comforting? Or alienating? Or both? 3,000 years later, millions of people still go to Jerusalem and stand before the Western Wall, which is the closest they can get to where the temple once stood. They press their hands against the stones. They squeeze their prayers into the cracks. Perhaps the answer to the question lies in this gesture. Maybe closeness has always been enough. At midday in Jerusalem, the sun beats down. There is no shade in the market. There is no air conditioning. There is no cold water. In summer, temperatures rise to 35 degrees, sometimes reaching 40. As the day heats up, the smells of animals, sweat, and cooking fires grow stronger. Yet no one stops. In Old Jerusalem, lunch is the smallest meal of the day. It is not what we would recognize as a typical lunch, just a handful of dried figs, a piece of bread left over from breakfast, and perhaps a few olives. It is usually eaten standing up whilst working. The main meal is eaten in the evening, once the day's work is finished and the family has gathered together. Craftsmen work in the heat, carpenters shaped wood, potters turned clay, and blacksmiths worked in the forge. This was one of the hardest jobs in the ancient city, standing by the fire in 40-degree heat to transform iron and bronze into tools, weapons, and the hundreds of small metal objects required for daily life. Priests worked under the scorching sun, too. The temple's activities never ceased. Morning sacrifices, midday sacrifices, afternoon sacrifices. The same rituals, the same prayers, and the same incense smoke rising from the same hilltop every day. The women, who had not rested before dawn, continued with their tasks. Water still had to be carried. Dinner had to be prepared. The children had to be looked after. The household never stopped, even in the scorching heat. Social life in ancient Jerusalem was structured in layers. At the very top was the royal palace, first David's, then Solomon's. Envoys from Egypt and Phoenicia came here. Meticulously prepared banquets were held here. Political marriages were arranged. Imperial affairs were conducted over food and wine. Below that were the priestly class, families who had served in the temple for generations. They lived in the finest houses in the upper city, close to the Temple Mount. They married amongst themselves. Their discussions centered on theology, rituals, and the correct interpretation of the law. Below them were merchants and craftsmen. These were the people who kept the city running. In the middle city, they lived in comfortable yet unpretentious homes. They had opinions on every subject and did not hesitate to share them. At the very bottom were the poor, day laborers who worked for whoever hired them that morning, widows with no male relatives to support them, strangers who had come to Jerusalem and never left. The city took them all in. What were people talking about? The things people always talk about, the weather and the harvests, because everything depended on the rain. They talked about the king's decisions, too, because they affected taxes. They talked about their neighbors, too, because in a city of 10,000 people, everyone knew each other. Religion, not as abstract theology, but as a daily practice. Which sacrifice was appropriate for which sin? Whether the priest performed the rite correctly. What did God want from ordinary people on an ordinary Tuesday? And gossip, endless gossip. The Bible itself is full of such stories, tales of jealousy, betrayal, greed, love affairs, and family quarrels. These are not exceptional events. They form the fabric of daily life and are recorded precisely because they are universal. In such a small town, privacy was virtually non-existent. Your neighbors knew when you argued with your spouse. They knew when your business was struggling. They knew when your child was ill. The community was both suffocating and supportive, just like every other small community in human history, just as it is now. In ancient Jerusalem, everyone was religious. Not in the sense that we understand it today, though. Religion was not a choice. It was simply part of life. It was the calendar itself. It explained why the week consisted of 7 days and why the seventh day was different from the others. The Sabbath brought everything to a halt. From Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, work was forbidden. No lighting fires, no cooking, no shopping. You couldn't travel beyond a certain distance. Bread had to be baked before Friday sunset. Meals had to be prepared before sunset on Friday. Lamps had to be lit before sunset on Friday. And then came rest. It was a time to shed the weariness of the week, both physical and spiritual. In a world where physical labor was the norm, and most people worked from dawn to dusk 6 days a week, the Sabbath was not a burden. It was the most radical idea in the ancient world. All other ancient civilizations made their workers and slaves labor every day. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Romans, the Greeks. No one stopped for a day in 7. The Jewish week, with its mandatory day of rest and the equality applied to masters and servants with regard to rest, was an extraordinary social innovation. The idea that your servant, or even your animal, deserved a day of rest once every 7 days was revolutionary. That is the question. In a city where religion was everything, where the silhouette of the temple dominated the skyline and the calendar was sacred, and where God was not an abstract concept, but a present and demanding presence, what became of those who doubted? The day begins and ends with light. Yet, in ancient Jerusalem, evening light was both precious and expensive. Oil lamps. Clay bowls were filled with olive oil, and a linen wick was placed on top, floating in the oil and burning with a small, smoky, and unreliable flame. Keeping a single lamp alight all night cost the equivalent of about an hour's wages. Most families used just one lamp, and sometimes none at all. This meant that life narrowed when the sun went down. You would come home, you would eat, then you would sleep. Dinner was the most important meal of the day. Everything the family had been preparing since midday would come together at this time. There would be lentil stew, the dish mentioned in the story of Jacob and Esau, the meal for which Esau sold his birthright. If you were lucky, the bread would still be warm, roasted grain, vegetables, meat if you could afford it. However, meat was expensive and rare for most people. Animals were highly valued as they produced milk, wool, and labor, so they could not simply be slaughtered for Tuesday's dinner. The family ate together. This was not out of sentimentality, it was a necessity. There was a single fire, a single pot, and a single table. Everyone would eat the same meal in the same small space and discuss the same day. What did they talk about? The children recounted what they had learned at school. The men would talk about the market, the harvest, and any news that had been brought to the door. The women, who had worked longer than anyone else, would finally sit down. Then, in the darkness, by the light of a small burning lamp, the stories would begin. The stories told in the dark weren't meant to entertain. They were lessons. They provided a sense of identity. Without the printing press, mass literacy, or any technology other than the human voice and memory, they were the mechanism that enabled a civilization to perpetuate itself across generations. The Torah was not just a written text. Long before it was written down, it was an oral tradition. Every parent was expected to teach it to their children. The command is clear. Tell your children. Tell them what God did in Egypt. Explain why the Sabbath exists. Tell them who they are, where they come from, and what they must do in their lives. Then sleep. In most homes, the whole family slept in one room. They slept on mats on the floor, or sometimes on a raised platform. Animals might also be in the same building, separated by a low wall. In the summer, the heat meant that people slept on the flat roof, where it was cooler and they could see the stars and hear the sounds of the city below. In ancient Jerusalem, the last thing a person would see before going to sleep on a clear night was the same sky that Abraham had seen, the same stars, the same Milky Way stretching from horizon to horizon. And tomorrow, the cock would crow again. The millstone would begin to turn once more. The fire would be rekindled from the embers. Bread would be baked. The same day, again. 3,000 years later, in the same city, on the same hill, and under the same stars, the descendants of those people are still here. They are still telling the same stories. In the darkness, we started by asking questions. What did people eat for breakfast? What worried them? What made them laugh? What did ordinary people actually do with their days? 3,000 years of archaeology has taught us this. They ate bread, flat barley bread, baked on a clay griddle before dawn. They also ate olives, figs, and lentil stew. They drank water and diluted wine. They went to bed when it got dark because oil was expensive. They argued about prices in the market. They gossiped about their neighbors. They cheated each other by using dishonest weights, and then went to the temple to ask for forgiveness. They fell in love. They buried their dead. They told their children stories in the dark. The same things, the same arguments, the same love, the same fear. 3,000 years ago. What is extraordinary about ancient Jerusalem is not how different it was, it's how recognizable it is. The baker waking before dawn, the woman who never stopped working, the child running through the market, the merchant arguing about the price of grain, the priest performing the same ritual for the 30th consecutive year. These are not ancient people. These are people. And the city they built, burned, destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again, rebuilt again, still stands. The same hill, the same walls, the same prayers are said at the same wall. 3,000 years of the same day. That is Jerusalem,